am pleased to welcome to the Horizon stage two people from MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. Amy Emerson is the Chief Executive Officer of MAPS PBC, and Joy Sun Cooper is the Chief of Patient Access and the Head of Commercialization at MAPS PBC. And they will be speaking about, beyond FDA approval, preparing to launch MDMA-assisted therapy.
Thank you.
I think Julie already did my introduction. We're going to be talking about beyond FDA approval. We're going to be talking about what is it going to take to get to commercialization for MDMA-assisted therapy, and most importantly, how are we working to ensure accessibility in this new modality in the real world? Whoa.
Can you hear us okay? No, I think maybe we need more volume. Try again.
Okay, how's this?
Good.
Okay.
Just in time for the disclaimer.
There's something that keeps happening with the sound, though. Okay. So, before I start, a quick disclaimer. Our lawyers say we have to do this, right? So, the safety and efficacy of MDMA-assisted therapy is still under investigation. It is not yet approved. It doesn't work for everyone, and it carries risks. And if you want to know more about the incredible efficacy and safety of the program, you can look at our publication of our first phase 3 study, and that was published in May of last year. This year. Gosh, I'm already in 2022. So I also want to just give a little brief for those. I think there's a lot of you that are familiar with the journey of MAPS, but for those of you that are not, we've been around for 35 years. And we've been on a 20-year or more journey since we dosed our first participant. And that first dosing actually happened in Spain. And it was a very short-lived study due to political reasons that I'm not going to get into. So after that, it was a few more years before we could actually start our phase 2 program in the US. It took so that started in about 2004 and went all the way through 2015. This was a long phase 2 program. It was all done through philanthropy and all done very sequentially, which is a little different than how pharma companies that are fully funded get to do things. During that time, we started to publish our clinical trial results as we finished our phase 2 studies. We also really started to look at how we could give therapists an experiential session. So we started something called MT1, that's a therapist training study, and then we really established the roots of our training program that have been growing ever since. Further along, so after that, we did finish our phase 2 program. We had our very first FDA meeting for our end of phase 2, and from there, things started to move a little bit quicker. We saw our phase 3 program get approved by the FDA, and we got breakthrough therapy status for that program, which was really incredible. And during that time that we've been working on the phase 3, I feel like the field has just really, it's taken off and changed, as evidenced by what's been happening here at Horizons and how many people have joined in this new ecosystem. So at kind of the end of that, this slide is that we also were able to publish in Nature Medicine the data that I just referenced, and that had astonishingly good efficacy and safety results, which we were really proud of. It was the first phase 3 study of any psychedelic treatment. So now we're so now we're in the final stretch. This is working towards a new drug application, or an NDA. And this is what's required to get drug approval. We have to finish that phase 3 program, which we're getting close to. We call that MAP2. We're about 60% enrolled. At the beginning of next year, in the first quarter, we should have our interim analysis. We should be finishing that study in the end of 2022. Then we have to bring all that data together that we've collected during all of the phase 2, all of the phase 3, into these 5 modules of a new drug application. This goes to the FDA. The FDA will take 8 months, we hope, to make a decision. That's quicker than a lot of studies because we do have this breakthrough therapy status. If it's approved, the DEA will reschedule in 90 days. That's amazing. It feels incredible to be talking about that. And then this will allow for commercial sales in all states that automatically reschedule. Now that's about half the states. In the other half, it takes legislative action or administrative action, and we're already working, Joy's team is working really closely with people in these various states to make sure that goes as smoothly and quickly as possible. And we're also doing a lot of scaling within the Public Benefit Corp, which is what Joy and I are both a part of, in order to meet the requirements of, I feel like I just lost that, meet the requirements of the NDA submission and launch this commercial program into what we call medical access. Can you guys still hear me? I feel like the sound just changed. Let's see, is that better? Okay, so in parallel with this whole incredible amount of work to the path to approval, we also have to focus on what is our vision as a benefit corporation for how we want this to look in the real world. And we think of this as like a multifaceted vision that includes both what is the patient impact, what is the business model, and what are the broader changes to policy and the impact on society. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about patient impact. So we want to ensure that we have as many possibilities for patients to receive this, to benefit from the healing potential of this new therapy as possible. So how are we going to do this? One would be by trying to establish MDMA-assisted therapy as a first-in-class treatment, and we hope a standard of care for PTSD treatment for PTSD at any severity from any cause. And we also want to know that when this modality is used in the real world, that it is delivered with high quality of care to ensure that the outcomes remain as strong as what we've seen in the real world. We need this to happen, and we need to be able to measure it. So we're working on those types of programs right now, and Joy will tell you a little bit more about that. We also need to be promoting equitable access, and we have to start that now if it's really going to happen, and we have been working on this. We want to ensure that we are including access for all BIPOC, low-income, vulnerable populations, and ensuring that there is a really broad group of providers that have a similar lived experience to the people that they're treating. And then we need to ensure that there's insurance coverage for that. So to have this type of patient impact, we also have to have a lot of trained therapists. So I know there's probably a lot of people here that are interested in being one of those trained therapists. We want to be able to deliver this at scale. So we're aiming to have 30,000 practitioners by 2031. And we also feel like this isn't only laying the groundwork for commercialization, but it's laying the groundwork to launch other psychedelic therapies through these training programs and through having sites that are established, because some of them are going to want to continue to be involved in research, some of them are going to want to do the delivery of care, and some are going to want to do both. And so we really want to expand that. And our goal is to have 1 million people treated that have PTSD by 2031. Just a little goal. So the next facet of this vision is for it to be sustainable. And we need a good business model. And what we have created is a public benefit corporation that is owned by MAPS, the nonprofit. And the public benefit corporation can generate revenue from the sale of MDMA and become financially self-sustaining, because to this point, it had been all completely done through philanthropy, and that can't continue. So we like this model of the public benefit corp owned by the nonprofit because it really protects our ability to make decisions that maximize public benefit. It also allows us a way to cover our continuing costs of commercialization, because there isn't just like a one-time cost to get it into the market, right? It's a very big cost to manage this through the whole life cycle. And then we also want to reinvest in research and development and continue to explore other applications for MDMA and other molecules. So the final facet of this is much broader. This is changes to policy and how this affects society. This piece is more of the focus of MAPS, the nonprofit, and it's the broader vision of healing for all. So this part isn't so much in the realm of the public benefit corp, but we really support this, what MAPS is doing, by continuing to do our research, and we can support other organizations doing this as well. We very much support the legal status, like changing legal status of psychedelics, as in the Oregon Initiative. And the way we can support that is by ensuring when we do our research, it's out there in the public, it's available freely, and that we provide as much information on training programs as possible, and that we really clearly communicate risks and benefits. So now I am going to turn this over to Joy to get into a little more detail.
Thanks, Amy. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So we want to start to give you a window today into how we're starting to translate that vision, that big picture vision, into reality if we are successful in getting FDA approval for MDMA-assisted therapy. So there's, as those of you who saw me speak yesterday, there's a lot that we're doing in commercialization. There's so much that we could share with you, but because this is really our first public talk on this topic, we thought we would start with the basics. We realize that a lot of the questions that we get asked about our commercialization plans really have to do with like a basic and deceptively simple question, which is, what will MDMA-assisted therapy look like in the real world compared to what we've studied in our clinical trials? So in other words, when we talk about commercializing MDMA-assisted therapy, what exactly is it that we're referring to? So again, this is, I think, a deceptively simple question. This modality is on track to become as Amy said, a truly first-in-class treatment. To the best of our knowledge, this would be the first truly integrated drug therapy combination to be approved by the FDA. And so just as that has really pushed us to break new ground in our clinical development program, I think we're going to have to do the same in commercialization as well. The integration of drug and therapy really introduces a number of truly unprecedented questions. Probably the most important is how the therapy part of the treatment will be regulated. Therapy is technically outside of the scope of the FDA, and yet it's inextricably tied, of course, to the drug in our case, which is, of course, in scope for the FDA. So there are a lot of decisions regarding how the therapy might work in the real world that are not necessarily within our direct control. And they'll also be made much closer to the time of NDA submission when we present that full data package to the FDA, and then to closer to the time of a potential approval. So at this point, we're about, as you saw from the timeline, about 2 years out from our target approval and launch. So that means that we have a lot more questions in some cases than we do answers at this stage. Our team is really focused on engaging with regulators, developing the data and the evidence to support that engagement, to make sure that we get to decisions and outcomes that we think really can increase access and benefit patients the most. So that uncertainty kind of notwithstanding, we want to start to walk you through some of the major variables that will define what this modality looks like in the real world. And even where there's uncertainty, we want to at least share how we're thinking about it and what the outcome is that we're at least working towards. There are two big buckets of things we're trying to define. The first I call the treatment model. So what care is the patient actually getting when they get MDMA-assisted therapy? And then second, what is the provider model? So how is that sort of package of care actually delivered to the patient? So when we think about the treatment model, I think perhaps the most critical question is whether supportive therapy will be required, as it has been, of course, in our clinical studies. This distinction we want to draw here is whether on the one end the therapy would be required and actually enforced in practice, or on the other hand, if the therapy is merely a recommendation. We don't envision a scenario where the therapy isn't even recommended, just given the nature of the studies that we've done combining the two. For sessions where the drug is administered, we do believe that supportive therapy is absolutely essential for both safety and efficacy. And so given that, our intent is for the therapy to be required, not just recommended, in the drug label. So the label will be approved by the FDA, and that really is what defines how the drug is meant to be used. But as many of you probably know, the drug label doesn't always translate into clinical practice. And so we're exploring a number of options, which we can maybe talk about more in the Q&A, for how that therapy requirement could actually be enforced in practice. So what about PrEP and integration therapy? So here again, we believe that preparation and integration are really important for realizing the full potential of MDMA. But this is not something that you would typically see in a drug label. What we do plan to continue to do is to continue training on the importance of PrEP and integration through our MDMA therapy training program. We plan to advocate for it to be included in the clinical practice guidelines that we expect the field to develop over the next couple of years to really define what the standard of care is.
And I think also just making sure, don't seem to have it. We'll just talk loud. Also making sure that it's covered by insurance. Like that's one way to help ensure that we're, I'm sorry for the noise. I don't know what I'm doing that's causing that. That if it's covered by insurance, then that will help to make sure that those pieces are an essential element to the therapy package.
So there's also a related question of what kind of therapy the patient receives. So I think you heard, those of you who were present yesterday heard Michael Mithofer talk a bit about this. We plan to continue to train providers on the therapeutic approach that we've developed over many years and that we've studied in our clinical trials, but we don't envision mandating that to be used in real-world practice. We think that providers, once they've been appropriately trained in our approach, should really be free to utilize whatever therapeutic approach they feel would be best for the patient. We do expect to see, quite a lot of experimentation post-approval if we secure approval, and we really think that this will just lead to continued innovation, continued improvements in the practice of this new modality. So we also need to define how many encounters the patient actually receives when they get a course of MDMA-assisted therapy. In our trials, participants receive 3 medication sessions and a total of 12 non-drug PrEP and integration sessions. In the real world, we think that the number of each of these types of sessions should really be individualized and left to the clinician's discretion. So that means, some patients maybe would get 2 MDMA sessions instead of 3. Some clinicians might want to do more integration. Those sessions could be spaced out over a longer, period of time than in our tightly controlled clinical trials. There's a separate question of, as Amy was alluding to, of how payers will cover the treatment, right? We expect, based on some payer market research that we've recently concluded, that most payers will plan to cover to the label and follow the precedent of what was studied in the phase 3 program. Covering anything outside of that, so for example, covering more integration sessions, is still an unknown at this time. We often get asked whether patients could possibly receive more than 3 medication sessions. I don't know if you want to talk about
that. Right now, what we understand from FDA is that the label will say how the treatment was studied, and it was studied in a 3-dose model with the PrEP and integration, and anything outside of that is really an off-label use. And I think that the FDA will also require us as a phase 4 commitment to look at relapse and non-responders, to do more of a chronic intermittent, which is there's not a strict definition that we understand of where that line is, but if you were gonna have a label that included follow-up treatments and more treatments, say in 6 months or a year, that has to be studied. And so anything outside of what the initial approval package is, they would consider off-label.
So there's also a question of how long each encounter would be. We don't expect there to be any requirements regarding the non-drug therapy sessions. In our studies, those have been 90 minutes long. We do expect that the FDA will have a requirement through the REMS, which we'll talk a bit about in a moment, for the patient to be monitored for a certain amount of time when the drug is actually administered. We think that our data supports somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 hours of monitoring, but that's something that will be determined in the final labeling decision by the FDA. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how all of that care actually will be delivered in the real world. It may be helpful to first clarify that we expect that the majority of patients to be treated by what's called a care team. So a team of providers who each play kind of a distinct role in the process. We'll have a medical provider who does the medical evaluation and prescribing, a licensed behavioral health provider who provides the supportive therapy, and then an additional person that we're calling for now, a paraprofessional. So this is somebody who may or may not be licensed, who would also be present with the licensed provider when the drug is administered. Some prescribers might also be qualified to do the therapy, so in the case of psychiatrists, for example, but our expectation at this time is that the majority of physicians will likely choose to focus on the prescribing part of the treatment, just given how time-intensive the therapy is. So mirroring that kind of care team structure, there are three kind of broad elements to how MDMA-assisted therapy will be delivered. There's the prescribing, the therapy, and then the physical settings of care in which those activities actually will take place. So we'll kind of talk about each of those. How the prescribing will happen will largely be defined by the REMS and by regulations on controlled substances. So REMS stands for a Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. This is a program that the FDA imposes on a very small number of drugs that have both known benefits but also known risks. And the REMS places additional restrictions on how the product is used in real-world practice to ensure that those benefits continue to outweigh the risks. So we expect from our dialogue with the FDA that if we get approval, the FDA will require REMS on MDMA. We would then, as the sponsor, become responsible for implementing that program. So that means that our REMS has not yet been defined, and it actually won't be until a drug is approved, so that's 2 years from now. But we're in active dialogue, early dialogue with the FDA about how that might take shape, and we wanted to share a little bit about how we envision it could work. So our thought is that, So in order to prescribe MDMA, the provider would need to have, of course, a DEA license, and would need to enroll in our REMS. That would require completing like a short online training, 3 or 4 hours. This is not our 100-hour MDMA therapy training program. Our expectation is that physicians of all specialties, so not just psychiatrists, would be eligible to prescribe. We also expect that mid-level providers that have prescribing authority for controlled substances should also be able to prescribe this product. Our goal is for the prescriber to not have to be on site when the drug is administered. We think that our data supports that. We think that that's important for patient access as well. Again, this will be subject to FDA approval. The licensed behavioral health provider would be trained on how to monitor physical safety and be trained to call an on-call medical provider in case of like a medical emergency, and that would all be done kind of within their scope of practice. We also expect, once the prescription is written, that the drug would be delivered directly to the site of care via a specialty pharmacy, and that's a process that's called white bagging. We do not intend to distribute MDMA through a retail pharmacy system where the patient could go to a Walgreens, right, and pick up their MDMA. It would go directly. Sorry. Yes. Okay, so let's talk about how the therapy part of this treatment gets delivered. This is really where I think the most uncertainty lies, largely because it's not clear, what the regulatory framework is for a therapy that is integrated with a drug, right? This is really kind of uncharted territory that we're forging here. A very common question that we get is who is going to have to be in the room, right, when the drug is administered? Our belief is that an appropriate requirement would be for at least one licensed behavioral health provider, and again, one additional person who may or may not be licensed to be present. We would like to see both of these individuals be certified by our MDMA therapy training program, and there's a distinction between training and certification, which we can talk about. And we would ideally like to see these individuals certified by the eventual Board of Psychedelic Medicines and Therapies, which is in the process of being developed by the field. This team of 2 could see either one individual patient, as is the model in our studies, where we have a 2 therapist, 1 patient model, or they could potentially see more than one patient. So for example, in a group therapy format. So we are really excited about the potential of group therapy to reduce the cost of delivering this treatment and to kind of scaling the limited supply of therapists, trained therapists that we'll have. We're actually initiating a study in 2022 at the Portland VA looking at group therapy to further establish kind of the evidence base for that modality. Again, I think, I just want to emphasize it does remain unclear at this time, how these requirements would be instituted and enforced. We're exploring a number of different strategies, and over the course of the next year or so, we expect to have a lot more clarity about that. Okay, so we've talked about how the prescribing and therapy will work. Now let's talk about what physical kind of settings all of that activity might take place in. A really critical question we're working to answer is how the prescriber and the therapist will coordinate care. So can those two providers work in separate practice settings, and coordinate that way, or do they actually need to, or might they want to practice under the same roof, so to speak? Our goal is to create flexibility for both models. Again, we think that that's what will maximize access over the long term. I will say that as we begin to narrow in on the drug distribution model, so again, how the physical drug product actually moves through the system, we're seeing that that will likely have a significant impact on the types of care settings that will eventually be really appropriate or optimal for this modality. And where are these settings going to be located? Well, our vision, as Amy said at the beginning, is we want broad access across the US and then eventually globally. For launch, we are focused on maximizing access in about a dozen highest priority states that we've identified. These states are where we're kind of concentrating our launch preparations, so therapist training, rescheduling, government affairs work, our engagement with payers, and other activities. I don't know if you want to...
I just want to make sure that we're clear that that doesn't mean that it won't be available in all states as soon as it's rescheduled in that state. It's just that we have a concentration going on of like where we're really going to focus on making sure that there's more push within a state. It's too hard to do all 50 at one time, but it will be available as it's rescheduled in every state.
Okay, so hopefully this gives you a sense of what MDMA-assisted therapy could look like in the real world. We're working really hard to define what I like to call the kind of the rules of the road. I know many of the people in this room and beyond really wanted to help kind of be a part of this potential launch and help bring MDMA-assisted therapy to patients. So we're, again, working really hard to try to make clear what that could look like.
Okay, so I think you're getting a clear picture that we have a focus on equitable access. We're focused on a few critical enablers of this. First, we want to ensure that post-approval, the regulatory controls on how MDMA-assisted therapy is delivered are appropriate and evidence-based and reasonable, right? So this is where all this negotiation with FDA comes in. We want to strike that right balance between ensuring that there's safety of the modality and equitable, broad access. We're also really thinking about how to design a patient assistance program that ensures price is not a barrier. And that price, I know everybody's curious, but it's not set yet, and it won't be set until much closer to approval. What I can share now is that what we're thinking about with the price is really what is the end thing? What is the co-pay going to be? That has to be reasonable, and we want to capture a fair share of the value that our treatment creates for both the people with the PTSD, their families, payers, and society at large. And we want to be able to really have a generous patient access program. So let's see, I think I'm going to move on from there.
A little short on time.
Yeah.
The last point here is just on broad payer coverage. So securing coverage of the treatment is really critical to our access strategy. The therapy component of the treatment is intense, and so if it's not covered or if patients had to pay out of pocket, we do realize that a large number of the people we're trying to reach would not be able to afford it. We've started our engagement with payers on a market research basis this year. We'll be intensifying those efforts and starting our direct engagement with payers in 2022. I will say that I'm actually quite optimistic on this question of whether payers will cover the treatment, but we're very focused right now on, we're actually, great, we have more time. We're actually really focused right now on the how, right? I think the mechanics, and Leah sort of alluded to this a bit yesterday in her talk, the mechanics of how this very novel package of care gets covered is going to be really complicated. So that's really where we're focusing a lot of our effort right now. We're also just briefly.
I just want to say one more thing, since we actually have more minutes. Was like that setting the price too low can really it's like such a tricky thing, because if you set it too low, you jeopardize the goals of like making sure that we're sustainable and that it's getting out there and there's access and we have this generous program. But if you set it too high, then you are limiting coverage. So that was just all I wanted to say about that price thinking.
Okay, so briefly, I'll just also say, we're very focused on building out a diverse provider network. We could talk about that more for those who are interested. In terms of things like racial and cultural identity, geography as well, we really want patients from all backgrounds to be able to access this treatment. We want patients to be able to access, as Amy said, providers who have shared lived experiences. We think that that's incredibly important for all kinds of therapy, but particularly this one. And then, of course, underpinning a lot of our access work is effective patient advocacy, which will be stepping up over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think we envision that this would be like community-based clinics, specialty clinics. There might be things within institutions, where they have clinics. So really, we are looking at this as not as like, I know there's some types of treatments, and I think like even when esketamine came out, it's there's these like focused areas where it has to be these gold standard specialty clinics. That is not what we're going for. We really want this to be something that can be in really small clinics or in really large ones.
Okay, so here's a very simple and illustrative patient journey that kind of pulls together some of the elements that we talked about today. So what might this look like from a patient's perspective and a provider's perspective in the real world? So ideally, a patient who is struggling with PTSD would have heard about MDMA-assisted therapy and the potential of it even prior to approval, and maybe she starts to talk about it with the therapist that she's seeing. That therapist may have heard of MDMA before, but doesn't know very much about it. The therapist is then able to get educated through resources and tools that we develop and disseminate to the therapist community through our medical affairs function, which we're in the process of building right now. After approval, if that were to happen, the therapist would refer the patient to a nearby clinic that is offering MDMA-assisted therapy. This could be, as Amy said, it could be community-based clinics, specialized clinics. These could be some of our expanded access sites. We have 8 of those so far, hopefully more soon. It could be a phase 3 site. Maybe there are ketamine clinics, right, that have been preparing for the eventual approval of MDMA and begin to offer it. At that clinic, the patient would be seen by a physician who would have already enrolled in our REMS program. The physician would evaluate the patient, write a prescription, complete some REMS paperwork, which we are trying to keep as light as possible in our negotiations with the FDA, and the provider would also need to secure what's called a prior authorization from the insurance company, which we expect to be required for patients to be able to get their treatment covered. All of that sort of work that the provider does would be coordinated through what's called the patient hub that MAPS PBC will establish. So the patient would come back to the clinic a few weeks later to get to do prep therapy with a therapist who is certified by our MDMA therapy training program, and the patient would probably pay a modest copay at each of those appointments, as for kind of any therapy appointment. A few days before the scheduled medication session, what's called a specialty pharmacy would dispense the prescription and ship it to the clinic, where it would be stored securely according to controlled substance regulations. The product will likely be packaged in a single pack of 3 capsules. The first 2 would be for the initial dose, and the third would be for the optional supplemental dose. That's what MAPS gets paid for, right? MAPS would get paid for the medication based on negotiations, a negotiated price with each kind of payer who's covering the treatment. So the patient would complete that medication session and integration sessions that go with that over the course of several weeks or months. On the back end, the clinic would be billing her insurance for all of that care, for all of those appointments. They would use tools and guides that MAPS PBC would develop to explain that process. When the clinic maybe has questions or runs into issues with billing, they would be able, again, to contact what's called the field reimbursement specialist within MAPS PBC to get support in that process. So again, it's a lot of sort of hand-holding that we envision needing to do. Lastly, I think an important part of the vision for this is that the patient be able to access aftercare. So, ongoing support for integration, help plugging into a broader community of people who have shared experiences. We're in the early stages of fleshing out the vision for how we really want that to look. I think there could be digital elements of that. There could be in-person. I think there are pieces MAPS could deliver, and there are certainly elements that other people in the ecosystem could deliver as well.
Yeah, it's important. We know that when somebody's had this treatment, a lot of times what they want to do is be able to talk about it with other people that have had also a psychedelic experience, right? You want to share. I think we can all probably relate to that. And so having peer support or having these different places, there's a lot of room for innovation. It's something we haven't really been able to do in a clinical trial setting that we really think is important in the real world.
So there's a lot of detail under each step here that we won't go into, but hopefully this gives you at least a general but still sufficiently specific sense of how we're approaching this and what the world is that we're trying to bring about if we are successful in getting FDA approval.
So I hope you can see how much work we put into leading this charge as the drug sponsor and manufacturer. Yes. It's okay, stay up here, Julie, stay here. I just want to say, we're not just launching a drug, we're really building an entire ecosystem and a new paradigm. And we're not just treating PTSD, we're thinking about all mental health, and we're all a part of it, so. Now I'm done.
Joy, you need to give a trigger warning if you're going to say prior authorization, because there are doctors in the audience. And as soon as you said prior authorization, I couldn't hear anything else you said for a couple of minutes. I was like, they have to what?
We'll give you MDMA therapy for that.
Yeah. So, if you know, you know. I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions while the questioners get wrangled. And the first thing I actually wanted to ask, and just because I'm asking doesn't mean that I don't know the answer. Just want to let you guys know that. Julie. You guys are mentioning group therapy, which I think is obvious for economic reasons. And also, I would say even there's a tradition of having group practices and having group integration. And many of us here have been through circles of some sort, perhaps, where you have a weekend and you work with the same cohort, and maybe you stay in touch with that cohort afterwards. I know that synthesis retreats do this, where they keep everybody in touch. So my question is, do we need to do any research to show that MDMA group therapy is going to be effective before we can propose it? Is it in the REMS? Is it sort of a next phase?
I don't think that things like that will be in the REMS. I think the biggest concern that really the FDA has about this is with the REMS is diversion, and that it's because it's delivered on site only. We're really not sure, but we're trying to keep the REMS simple, right? The label will say how it was studied, so the group therapy won't also be in the label. And we're also working on studies. I think it's so important to do the studies and publish, right? Because that's what helps to support the clinical practice and having a good understanding of how many therapists do you need to how many participants, and should anybody have their sessions alone first and then in group, or how do they do their prep sessions? So all of that stuff should be getting figured out before approval in the studies that are starting to go on. And then I think people probably will have the freedom to practice medicine the way they want.
I wanted one of you to maybe just talk a little bit about, I know that MAPS received a large sort of unrestricted donation recently from Vine Ventures, and I know that Ryan Zurer is here.
Yes.
Doesn't necessarily want to come up, which I appreciate. But I just wanted to acknowledge that huge donation, and if you wanted to say anything about Vine and how that's
Yeah.
working.
We actually did want to invite Ryan to come up if he wanted to say something, just really briefly. Oh, no, we did. I'm sorry.
No pressure. Yeah, maybe just grab a mic.
And just like,
Hey,
we'll definitely
I
answer
actually
some.
just wanted to keep this
Okay.
about the medicine and about the therapies that you guys are providing,
Okay.
so we don't need to get too much into the commercial stuff. The one thing I would say is it's not a donation. We are,
Not a donation.
We are
Perhaps
making
an investment?
a financial
Not an
commitment.
investment either.
It's not an investment either. It's a novel financing vehicle that we've designed together with MAPS that allows them to stay nonprofit, but raise the substantial capital that they need to deploy psychedelic therapies around North America.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Vine Ventures. Are we ready for the first question?
Hi, I just wanted to first say thank you. And then I am involved with a psychedelic society, and I'm aware of a national network of psychedelic societies. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that being a potential resource for aftercare. I'm sorry.
For aftercare.
That's a great example of how to ask a question, by the way.
Watch and learn, people. Aftercare. So the psychedelic societies, the idea that there are a lot of them are already around, or like, I don't know, there's all sorts of groups forming and sanghas and psychedelic support. Can they be used for aftercare?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think that that's the type of thing that we're thinking of like there's a peer support and a place where people can come and share what their experiences have been and support each other, and it seems like that would be a good vehicle for that.
Another question, please.
Hopefully that's going to be a good example of a question too. Okay, so I'm curious, what do you think about like the patients that are like under a lot of, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder or depression? Don't you think that the model is a bit too long for some people? Like they might fall in the cracks. They're not going to be able to sustain the 12 session, especially some people have had bad experiences and there is no shortage of bad therapists. So like, what do you think about those people who might not be able to get through the whole program and they still need the treatment?
I think that I wish I had somebody up here. Maybe Julie has some thoughts on that too. So you're talking about like if somebody starts with their therapy pair and then it's not working out so well, and they need to either switch or they need to drop out of that?
Yeah, or it's just too long for them and they are unable to like sustain the program because they are thinking maybe they don't have trust in the system.
I mean, post-approval, it's like there's an option for 1, 2, or 3 sessions within the label, and that can be spread out further apart or closer together. I don't think there would be rules about like either that you could switch therapists or you could come back later to complete it. There's just, it's going to be so much different than what's going on in a clinical trial where we have to keep everything, really within these fairly strict parameters. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
I mean, I guess the idea is that not everybody some people are so symptomatic that they can't sort of last through a 12-week program before they get better. But one thing I would say is that, when you take away the placebo,
Yeah.
even after the first MDMA-assisted therapy session, the symptoms come way down.
Oh,
So
yes.
you're already feeling better and maybe more able to engage. But also, it's not one size fits all.
Yeah.
It's not, when it's research, it is one size fits all. And plus, you may not be getting MDMA. And even those people, very onerous sort of responsibilities for the research participant, and you may be getting placebo, and you have to come. But even those people who are really sick and symptomatic, they tolerate the 12 weeks. We didn't have a lot of people dropping out,
Yeah.
for instance.
It's pretty amazing, and I think that first session having such a big impact really does give people the hope to continue through the program.
And some of the people that dropped out, actually, it was because they got better.
Better after the
Like,
first.
Sorry, but I'm not gonna help you with this research because I'm feeling better now. And
Yeah.
keep in mind, as you probably well know, some of these people have been symptomatic for decades, and so 12 weeks to get better, especially if you really start getting better
Yeah.
early. It's not like in 12 weeks, maybe you'll feel better. But obviously, it's not going to work, doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah.
It's not for everybody. Luckily, we've got all sorts of options of what might work for different people.
And it's an incredible amount of hard work. And we have had people enter the study and be like, because of the media, I think there's a danger with the media making it sound like a magic pill, and that people come in and they're like, wow, I didn't know I was going to have to do so much work. And so some people aren't ready for that yet, and that's totally okay. It'll be there for them when they are.
I would love another question. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is, do you foresee a scenario where insurance companies might hold back reimbursement for this therapy with an indication for, such as a patient must have failed X amount of therapies or some other setbacks like that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Yeah, I think there's a distinct possibility that there will be what are called kind of step edits or utilization management controls. Sorry, again, trigger warning for.
Trigger warning.
Step therapy requirements.
Yeah, where patients, so as Amy said, we're going for a label that would authorize this for a patient with PTSD of any severity, any cause. Separate. Oh, sorry. Is that what's causing the feedback? Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Madeline. So that's the label that we're going for. There is still a possibility that payers will cover it in a more narrow way than what we get in the label, right? So they might require patients to go through some kind of SSRI treatment or psychotherapy, talk therapy before getting this. We're hopeful that will be the case. We'll obviously be working in our engagement with payers to minimize those kinds of controls and broaden paid access for as many patients as possible.
I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the FDA approval, it's not going to be for treatment-resistant
It's
right.
not treatment
right?
resistant
So
PTSD.
you shouldn't have to prove, oh, this person had X, Y, and Z, and those didn't work, so now we're trying this. That's not what the FDA approval is. So that might help with step therapies.
Yeah.
But I will tell you as a practicing psychiatrist that there are some insurance companies that want me to prescribe some other drug before I can prescribe the one that I really think is going to help the patient. That's when I get on the phone. It's not fun for any of us, but sometimes you push a little and you get what you want. Sometimes you don't. Any other comments about that issue of, okay, step therapy. Next question.
Hi, my name is Jay, and I want to start by saying thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm curious as to what potential alternative success metrics you're looking at implementing in the rollout of your product and program for those that don't fall under clinical success metrics or financial success metrics.
You have that one.
What a great question. Gosh, as Amy said at the beginning, our vision for success is multifaceted, right? I mean, if only this were as easy as launching a typical drug in a typical for-profit structure where we could measure things like how many scripts get written, what is our, gross to net, ratio. But, because we are part of the MAPS family, right, we do have to develop this much kind of broader, much more multifaceted vision. I can't share specific KPIs necessarily that we've developed yet, but I don't know if maybe.
It was just occurring to me also that we're developing this B impact assessment, like similar. We won't be a certified B Corp because they don't take people doing what we're doing in this research with that. But we're creating our own impact assessment, and there will be some measurements within that we'll be using to hold ourselves to a certain standard. If you have, it sounded like you might have had some ideas. Come talk to us later.
More questions, please.
Hi, my name is Paul. Thank you for your time today. One of the first steps in the patient journey that you showed us is probably one of the most important, getting that referral from a practitioner who won't do the therapy to one that will. I'm wondering what your thinking or approach so far to reaching and educating that population, the referral population, is or might be. Thank you.
Yeah. Do you want to? Oh, I can start off and then Amy can finish. So, so I mentioned the term medical affairs. So that's sort of the name that's used to describe the group of people within a pharma company whose job is to go out and help educate the medical and scientific community about a new treatment or a new product. We're in the process of building that function right now. I think it's going to be absolutely critical for our launch, as it is with any launch, but ours in particular. And so that will be a group of clinicians who actually goes out and engages the therapist community as well as the prescriber and physician community. So there'll be
Primary care.
Primary care, right? Sort of all of the different pieces of all of the different providers that we think the patients we're trying to reach might touch. Those are the people we want to educate. So we'll be publishing, we'll be at conferences, we'll be, really using multiple channels to try to engage providers, not solely to try to sort of convince them to come get trained, but as you said, to just even increase their level of awareness so that they can be referral sources into our
And we're starting that work now, really getting out to the conferences. Julie has a very exciting talk to be giving.
Yeah, Rick and I are going to speak to the American Psychiatric Association at their conference in May, so that's pretty exciting. I would also really encourage you, everybody, when it's during the week and they're like, what'd you do this weekend? Like, let people know you're at a psychedelics conference. Let therapists know, let your therapist friends know. Tell your therapist who is psychedelic literate to tell 2 friends who are illiterate so that they can tell 2 friends and so on. One more, or maybe 2 more questions, depending on how concise you are.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll try and be concise. My name is Eric. I'm a therapist provider at Kaiser Permanente in Los Angeles. For those who don't know, Kaiser is a huge organization. It is the insurance and the providing of care like the VA. Question. This is great. I'm so excited. Has anyone from MAPS reached out to Kaiser?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And great.
We're working with Kaiser Northern California. They're interested in becoming an expanded access site and maybe even applying for their own expanded access. And so I don't know how that will turn out, but we're definitely engaged. Find Richard Roston at Kaiser in Oakland.
I have a
Wait, are
meeting
you a
with him on
plant? Did you know
Tuesday.
the answer to this question?
No, I didn't.
Well,
I did not.
It was
Thank
not
you.
a plant.
Thank you.
That's big news for MAPS and Kaiser. It's very exciting, and I
Yeah.
didn't know if we were allowed to say anything, but I guess we are.
I don't know if I was allowed to say it either, but
Maybe,
I did.
Let's just keep it in this room. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Andy. I'm a psychiatry resident. I'm curious if there's any plans or future infrastructure for implementing any of these psychedelic or MDMA-assisted therapies in an inpatient setting, because we have a lot of patients with PTSD who end up on the inpatient units.
Inpatient.
Are you talking about
Yeah,
inpatient MDMA therapy?
Yes,
Inpatient.
inpatient psychiatric
Is
setting.
there anything that would prevent it?
That's right. So I would,
You
I
take
guess the
it.
way I would answer that, and please build on or correct me, Amy, is that we really envision this as primarily an outpatient therapy. We think that that is important to maximize access. To limit it to an inpatient setting, I think would be really detrimental to the goal of broad access. That said, I don't think there's anything that we're doing in the design of the commercial strategy that would prevent this from being delivered in an inpatient setting. Certainly, I think there are some, and Julie maybe can speak more to this, there, I can imagine would be some patients for whom an inpatient setting might be more appropriate, maybe.
Well, I mean, I will
don't
tell you
know.
as a psychiatrist who's worked in hospitals and in psychiatric emergency rooms that
Maybe that's actually
my
not ideal.
experience is that an inpatient psychiatric ward is not the most
Yeah.
therapeutic place to be. I don't know, fight me on this. But I don't see why it couldn't, when I was at the Bronx VA, shout out to the Bronx VA who's going to be doing PTSD research, we had a schizophrenia research unit. I was doing schizophrenia research, that was my unit. We had people coming in to do research protocols, and they would stay on the research unit, but it wasn't quite as hectic as a like sort of normal, typical inpatient psych unit. So I could see situations like that, but that research isn't being done. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't. I mean, I'm particularly interested in the possible use of MDMA therapy for people with schizophrenia. If we did a study like that, we'd probably want people who were not on meds. I don't know if those people would be comfortable being housed somewhere for 12 weeks. I mean, I personally wouldn't want that for me. But that may be how we have to do it.